Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about the history of literary criticism. History of literary criticism. The history of literary criticism traces the evolving ways humans have interpreted, evaluated, and theorized literature across centuries. Originated in ancient Greece with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, literary criticism began as a moral and philosophical inquiry into the purpose and effect of poetry. During the medieval period, criticism aligned with the theological interpretation, viewing texts through allegorical and religious lenses. The Renaissance revived classical principles, while Neoclassicism emphasized the order, reason, and decorum. Romantic and Victorian critics shifted focus toward emotion, imagination, and moral engagement. In the modern and contemporary periods, literary criticism expanded into diverse theoretical frameworks, exploring language, ideology, identity, and power. First one, classical criticism, 5th century BCE to 5th century CE, that is AD. Classical criticism refers to the earliest tradition of literary thought emerging between the 5th century BCE and 5th century CE, that is AD, primarily in ancient Greece and Rome. It laid the foundational principles of literary evaluation, focusing on the concepts like mimesis, that is imitation, catharsis, and the moral purpose of art. Key figures in the classical criticism include Plato, who viewed poetry with suspicion, and a student Aristotle, who provided a systematic defense of it and its poetics. Roman critics like Horace and Longinus expanded on Greek ideas, emphasizing style, emotional impact, and the fusion of pleasure with instruction. This period established the enduring frameworks of genre, decorum, and rhetorical analysis that influenced the criticism for centuries. Now the key thinkers in the classical criticism. First one, Plato. Plato critiqued poetry as imitation of an imitation, that is mimesis, considered poetry morally corrupting. Then Aristotle defended poetry in his work Poetics, emphasized the catharsis, unity, and structure. Then we have Horace, who blended utility and pleasure through the work Ars Poetica, and he also emphasized the decorum. Then we have Longinus. Longinus introduced the concept of the sublime, highlighting emotional and stylistic greatness. Then we have Quintilian, who emphasized the moral and rhetorical education of the orator. Now the core features of classical criticism, they emphasized on mimesis, that is imitation, literature judged by its ethical function and formal balance, then priority of genre rules, especially tragedy and epic. The next stage in the development of criticism is the medieval criticism, that is 5th century to 15th century AD. Medieval criticism, spanning the 5th to the 15th century, was deeply rooted in Christian theology and scholastic traditions. Literature during this period was primarily interpreted through religious and allegorical frameworks, emphasizing moral and spiritual meaning. Critics like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas focused on reconciling classical texts with Christian doctrine. The fourfold method of interpretation, that is, literal, moral, allegorical, and analogical, was central to reading and understanding texts. Overall, medieval criticism viewed literature as a tool for divine instruction and a moral guidance rather than aesthetic appreciation. Now, the key figures from the medieval criticism include St. Augustine, who interpreted texts allegorically, aligned literature with a Christian doctrine. Then we have Boethius, Dante, and Thomas Aquinas, who emphasized the theological allegory, moral instruction. Then we have Venerable Bede, Isidore of Seville. They are early Christian literary commentators. Now, the core features of medieval criticism include allegorical interpretation of texts, literal, moral, or allegorical. Then literature served religious and didactic purposes. Then a classical text reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Now, the third stage in the development of literary criticism is the Renaissance criticism. Renaissance criticism, 15th to the early 17th century. Renaissance criticism, emerging between the 15th and early 17th centuries, was shaped by the revival of classical learning and the humanist movement. This period marked a renewed interest in ancient Greece and Roman literary theories, especially those of Aristotle and Horace. Critics such as Philip Sidney and Lodovico Castelvetro emphasized the value of poetry as a moral and imaginative force. There was a growing focus on the creative role of the poet, the importance of artistic unity, and the relevance of classical rules to contemporary literature. Renaissance criticism bridged classical ideas with modern literary concerns, laying the groundwork for national literary traditions. Now, the key thinkers included in the Renaissance critical period include Philip Sidney, who wrote the book An Apology for Poetry, defended the moral and imaginative value of poetry. Then we have Scaliger, Minturno, Castelvetro, who recovered Aristotle, emphasized the rules of classical branches. Then we have Ben Jonson, who advocated for classical decorum and structure in drama. Now, the core features of Renaissance criticism include a return to classical text and humanist values, a defense of poetry's ethical and imaginative power, beginning of a national literary tradition, for example, Shakespearean drama. Now, the fourth stage of literary criticism is in the neoclassical period. Neoclassical criticism, late 17th to 18th century. Neoclassical criticism flourished in the late 17th to 18th centuries, emphasized order, reason, decorum, and adherence to classical principles in literature. Heavily influenced by ancient critics like Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus, this period valued clarity, balance, and a moral instruction. Italian humanists such as Julius Caesar Scaliger and Lodovico Castelvetro played a key role in reviving and interpreting classical theories adapting them for contemporary literary analysis. They stress the rules of genre, the unities of time, place, and action, and the imitation of nature as essential to good writing. Neoclassical critics saw literature as a rational and disciplined art form intended to delight and instruct. Italian humanists. Italian humanist literary criticism emerged during the Renaissance period, marking a significant shift from medieval religious interpretations to classical secular analysis. Rooted in the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts, Italian humanists emphasized the moral, rhetorical, and aesthetic dimensions of literature. Figures such as Dante Alighieri, Petrarch, Lorenzo Valla, Julius Caesar's Caligula, and Lodovico Castelvetro played a central role in reviving and adapting classical literary theories, especially those of Aristotle and Horace. They promoted imitation, that is, imitation of classical models, the value of eloquence, and the centrality of human experience in literature. This movement laid the intellectual foundation for Renaissance and a later neoclassical criticism across Europe. Now the key figures under Italian humanism include Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321, who wrote the work The Divine Comedy, though more poetic than theoretical. Then we have Boccaccio, 1313 to 1375, who wrote the work Genealogy of the Pagan Gods, in a defense of poetry. Then we have Julius Caesar's Caligula, 1484 to 1558, who wrote the work Poetics, an Aristotelian influence. Now we will move to the French neoclassicists. French neoclassic critics, active primarily in the 17th and 18th centuries, were heavily influenced by the principles of classical antiquity, particularly those of Aristotle and Horace. They emphasized the importance of reason, order, and restraint in literature, advocating for the strict adherence to the classical unities of time, place, and action in drama. Prominent figures such as Nicolas Boileau, Jean de La Fontaine, and Voltaire sought to refine and elevate the French language, promoting clarity, balance, and harmony in literary expression. Their criticism often involved the belief that literature should both delight and instruct, offering moral and social commentary. French neoclassicism played a pivotal role in shaping modern Western literary traditions, influencing both the formal structure and the intellectual values of European writing. Now the key figures under French neoclassicism include Nicolas Boileau, 1636 to 1711. The major work of Nicolas Boileau include L'Art Poétique, and his key ideas include imitation of nature and the ancients, clarity, order, and decorum, and he was influenced by Horace and Aristotle. Now moving on to the English neoclassicist critics. English neoclassical critics, active during the late 17th and 18th centuries, were deeply influenced by the classical ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, emphasizing order, rationality, and decorum in literature. Figures such as John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Samuel Johnson, and Joseph Harrison sought to refine English literature by adhering to classical principles, particularly in drama and poetry. They upheld the idea that literature should instruct as well as entertain, with a focus on moral values and universal truths. Neoclassical critics also placed the great importance on the rules of genre, wit, and the clarity of expression, often challenging the extravagant style of the previous Renaissance period. Their influence helped shape our literary tradition, characterized by formal structure, restraint, and intellectual clarity, laying the groundwork for the development of English literature in the 18th century. Now, the key figures under English neoclassics include Sir Philip Sidney, 1554-1586, who wrote the work An Apology for Poetry, and his key ideas include defense of poetry against the Puritan attacks, poetry as moral and imaginative education. Then we have Ben Jonson, 1572-1637, and his key ideas are classical unity and decorum, practice aligned with the Horatian ideals. Then we have John Dryden, 1631-1700, whose major work was An Essay of Dramatic Poesy. Then another work that is Preface to Fables. Now, Dryden's key ideas include comparative criticism, defense of drama, neoclassical structure with a creative freedom. Then we have Alexander Pope, 1688-1744, whose major work is An Essay on Criticism. Key ideas include true wit, nature as the standard, balance and harmony, criticism as an art. Then we have Samuel Johnson, 1709-1784, whose major works include Preface to Shakespeare and another book that is The Lives of the Poets. Samuel Johnson's key ideas include judicious criticism, Shakespeare's universality, literature and morality. Now, the key features of English neoclassical critics include emphasis on reason, order, decorum, and classical imitation. Literature must reflect universal human nature. Importance of rules, unity, and propriety. The critics judged texts by how well they followed classical models. Now moving on to the Romantic criticism, late 18th and mid 19th century. Romantic criticism, emerging in the late 18th and peaking in the mid 19th century, marked a significant departure from the rational, rule-bound approaches of neoclassicism. Romantic critics emphasized their individualism, emotion, imagination, and the sublime, celebrating nature and the inner workings of the human spirit. They rejected rigid classical structures in favor of creative freedom and spontaneity, believing that art should express the complexities of the human experience. Figures like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Percy Bysshe Shelley argued that poetry should convey deep emotional truths and engage with personal and societal issues. Romantic criticism shifted the focus of literary evaluation from formalism to subjective experience, deeply influencing both the literature and the way we understand artistic expression. Now, the key thinkers under Romantic criticism include William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Victor Hugo. Major works include Preface to Lyrical Ballads, Biographia Literaria, Defense of Poetry. The core features of Romantic criticism include an emphasis on emotion, imagination, and individual genius. Poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Focus on the creative process and the artist's subjectivity. Distrust of rigid rules, emphasize on originality and a natural expression. The next development of literary criticism happened in the Victorian period. Victorian criticism, mid to late 19th century. Victorian criticism, flourishing in the mid to late 19th century, was characterized by a focus on moral, social, and intellectual concerns, reflecting the rapidly changing landscape of industrialized England. Critics like Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin, and George Eliot emphasized the importance of literature in shaping society, advocating for works that promoted moral integrity, social responsibility, and intellectual depth. Victorian critics often balanced their reverence for classical traditions with an openness to the complexities of modern life, including issues like class, industrialization, and the role of religion. Literature was seen as a tool for cultural and moral improvement, with a strong focus on realism and a character development. Victorian criticism laid the foundation for later debates on aestheticism, realism, and social reform, influencing literary movements into the 20th century. Now, the key Victorian critics include Matthew Arnold, John Ruskin, Walter Pater. The major works emerged during the Victorian period include The Function of Criticism, Culture and Anarchy, The Renaissance. Now, the core features of Victorian criticism include literature as a moral and a cultural force, disinterested criticism by Arnold, that is, critics should seek the best, that is, thought and said. Then aestheticism versus moralism, that is, tension between art for art's sake and art for social purpose. Now, the next stage of the development of literary criticism, that is, early 20th century criticism or modernism, from 1900s to 1945. Early 20th century criticism, often associated with a modernism, was marked by a break from traditional literary forms and the rise of new experimental approaches. Critics and writers like T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and James Joyce sought to reflect the complexities of modern life, often exploring themes of alienation, fragmentation, and the subconscious mind. Modernist criticism rejected conventional narrative structures and instead embraced the stream of consciousness, symbolism, and a non-linear storytelling to capture the disorienting realities of the early 20th century. There was also a shift toward formalist criticism, which focused on the internal mechanics of a text, as seen in the works of critics like I.A. Richards and Cleanne Brooke. This period of literary criticism redefined the relationship between literature, culture, and society, laying the groundwork for later developments in literary theory. Now, the key movements and figures under early 20th century criticism or modernism include, first of all, formalism or Russian formalism. First of all, Victor Slawski, Roman Jakobson, and they gave importance to form over content and a defamiliarization. Then the new critics or Anglo-American critics like Clean Brooke, T.S. Eliot, I.A. Richards, they gave importance to clause reading, irony, paradox, unity, etc. Then we have a psychoanalytic criticism of Sigmund Freud, Jung, and they gave importance to unconscious drives, archetypes, dream logic. Now the core features of early 20th century criticism or modernism include a shift from author or intent to text and structure, rise of clause reading and emphasis on textual integrity, literature as autonomous with intrinsic meaning. Now moving on to the next stage in the development of literary criticism is mid to late 20th century, that is post-war criticism from 1945 to 1980s. Mid to late 20th century criticism spanning from 1945 to 1980s saw a diversification of literary theory and an increasing emphasis on a social, cultural, and a psychological context. This period was heavily influenced by movements like structuralism, post-structuralism, Marxism, feminism, and a new historicism, which sought to understand the literature in relation to power, identity, and history. Critics such as Roland Barthes, Michael Foucault, and Judith Butler challenged traditional notions of authorship, language, and gender, advocating for a more complex and fluid understanding of texts. Literature was no longer seen as a mere reflection of universal truth, but as a site of ideological struggle and a cultural construction. Post-war criticism expanded the scope of literary analysis, incorporating a wider range of perspectives and theoretical frameworks that would continue to shape literary studies into the 21st century. Now, the major movements and key figures under the mid to late 20th century or post-war criticism include, first of all, structuralism, propounded by Ferdinand de Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, and Roland Barthes. They saw language as a systems, then a binary opposites. Then we have post-structuralism and a deconstruction, like Derrida, then a Michael Foucault. They saw language as unstable, meaning as deferred. Then we have a breeder response criticism, mainly by Stanley Fish and Wolfgang Iser. Reader creates meaning is the main idea of reader response criticism. Then we have a Marxist criticism by Lucas, Althusser, Eagleton, etc. They emphasize the ideology, class struggle, material conditions. Then we have a feminist criticism by Gilbert and Guba, Helen Zixo, and Shawalter, and they gave importance to gender, patriarchy, the female voice. Then we have the psychoanalyst critics like Lacan, talking of language and the unconscious. Now the core features of mid to late 20th century or post-war criticism include turn to language, ideology and power, interrogation of authorial intention and objective meaning, emphasis on social, political and psychological context. Now, The next stage of literary criticism, that is contemporary criticism or postmodern criticism, from 1980s to the present. Contemporary criticism, shaped by postmodernism from the 1980s to the present, challenges traditional boundaries of literature, identity, and meaning. Postmodern critics like Jean Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, and Judith Butler emphasized the fluidity of truth, the instability of language, and the deconstruction of established norms. Literature is viewed not as a reflection of reality, but as a construct influenced by power dynamics, cultural narratives, and social context. This era also embraces interdisciplinary approaches, incorporating insights from psychology, media studies, and technology to analyze texts in innovative ways. Contemporary criticism emphasized the diversity, marginalization, and the breakdown of grand narratives, marking a shift toward more fragmented, non-linear, and self-referential forms of literary analysis. Now, the major figures coming under contemporary criticism, major theories: post-colonial criticism, Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, giving importance to the discussions like imperialism, identity, and hybridity. Then we have a queer theory by Butler, Sedgwick, and they gave importance to discussions like gender fluidity and performativity. Then we have eco-criticism, nature, environment, and human nature relationships. Then we have cultural studies by Stuart Hall, Raymond Williams. They talk about mass culture, subcultures, media, etc. Then in the contemporary criticism, talking about the most recent developments, we have digital humanities, that is computational analysis, AI, and literature. Now talking about the key features of contemporary criticism, we can see that it is mainly based on the emphasis on identity politics, interdisciplinarity, and the cultural context. We can see the critique of grand narratives, essentialism, and a universality. There is also a focus on marginalized voices and pluralism of interpretation.